my Palo Alto Networks firewall, the high availability concepts. We're going to start talking about how to put things together, well, to be highly available. I don't want to make sure that nothing falls apart on our network. That's kind of the important stuff. So how is it that we add to the resiliency of our cool firewalls? Now, where exactly is the fun in just a single point of failure in your network? That's just really not cool anyway. So don't have one. Don't have any reason for it. High availability is the name of the game right here. And we're going to find new and exciting ways to do this, and really multiple ways to play the game as well, by simply adding a second firewall into the mix. Now, of course, there are things that come along with this, cables and links and stuff like that, and possibly other equipment if we're going to, have no single point of failure. But particularly on my firewall, security being a very important piece of the network, definitely a good thing. Now, all of them, as far as my modes go, start with the same basic rules. Okay, so my HA cluster, which is what we're kind of calling this stuff, so USTER. So my HA cluster in here must consist of 2 and only 2 firewalls, and they must be identical. So that means that they have to have the same hardware, they have to have the same software images, and really, when we're done, they'll have the same security policy as well. Because if I mix and match stuff on here, it can certainly make my security life very confusing. So we don't want to do this. Now, from a mode standpoint, I can look at what we call, there's an AP or AA. And what this stands for is active-passive or active-active. So from my firewall perspective on here, active-passive means that I have one processing rules and the other one just sitting there waiting, seeing what's going on. In an active-active world, of course, that's not the case. We're going to be processing packets on both sides. We're going to have different things going on, different stuff happening for it, but we can do everything that we want to. And the nice part about it is, I guess we'll start with active-passive. Okay? So active-passive can work with, we can work in layer 2 mode, I can work in layer 3 mode, or I can work in my virtual wire mode. So only one device at this point processes traffic at any given time. There's going to be synchronization. So we'll sync things. So synchronization of my config, my certificates, my response pages, which is what the users will be sending back, and of course the responses to that as well, and any stateful connections. Right? So anything that we're doing in there, keep in mind there is not synchronization of stateless connections. So while the goal is going to be 0% packet loss, the truth is that you're going to have some, but it's only going to be of stateless connections only. So, things that are doing UDP stuff like video streaming or things like that, there may be some packet loss as I switch over from number 1 to number 2, my active one to my passive one on there. The firewalls are going to be continuously synchronizing the configuration and the stateful connections, the session information on it. Okay? So kind of a neat thing for it. Now, I suppose one other thing to point out, so small firewalls, so we'll say greater than or equal to 500 right here. The PA200 and my PAVM models are only capable of what we call HA Lite. And HA Lite does not have the connection synchronization right here. It's a little bit different in there. It's basically active-passive, but without the session synchronization. So definitely on the smaller, the branch firewalls or the lower-end firewalls, there will be some packet loss, and there will be reset connections when you fail over. So I'm still highly available. I have less downtime than if I only had one firewall and it failed and had to wait for you or I to come fix it. Well, okay, let's be serious, somebody else, but whatever. But I had to wait for somebody to actually physically go there and do something with it and fix it. So we are more, we'll just call this more highly available at any level. But on the larger devices, so PA500 and up, and certainly once I get to my 2000, 3000s and those guys, I am completely committed to full high availability. Okay? Now, other nice thing is larger interfaces, larger firewalls anyway, are going to have some dedicated interfaces for doing a lot of this stuff. When I get into my whole HA mode on here and what I'm, passing information back and forth, there are interfaces that we will need to use to do this. So let me pause for a second here, kind of clear this off, and I got a better picture of how that's going to look. So when I start looking at this on here, I have ways of going through and configuring my HA links, and we'll get to that in just a little bit. But there are two interfaces that we're going to be talking about used specifically for high availability, and they're going to be named HA1 and HA2. Now, if you happen to have one of your larger firewalls, so PA 3000, 4000, 5000 up in there, you actually have a separate interface. So you'll have a separate physical connection here labeled exactly that. The rest of us, on the other hand, need to reuse one of the interfaces that we already have and list its type when we create it as HA. So I guess a little bit more irritating, but bigger devices definitely in game for it. HA1 is my control plane link. So this is used for control plane communications. Synchronizes the config. It's an L3 interface. It will need an IP address. And oh, by the way, management. So my admin accounts and things like that, management info, stuff about my console, or not console, but my management interface in here is not synchronized. Everything else that we're going to be doing is synchronized in the configuration. HA2, on the other hand, is data plane, or my session synchronization. It is layer 2 only by default. I guess that means it's not only, but it's layer 2 by default. We have some options in here. Now, HA has three methods that we can start looking for in terms of figuring out problem detection. I can do a heartbeat polling. And that's actually bidirectional in nature in there. I can do link monitor. So where I take a look at the physical interface or link groups for larger firewalls, or I can do path monitoring. And path monitor is like a layer 3. It's an ICMP ping to test a path in there. And so those are different ways that I can pull between my devices and make sure that they're actually, both alive, the way that things are going to be. My device states, so when I start looking at my configuration on here, I'll have, let's see, states. I have initial, which is really where we're just getting started for things in here. It starts negotiating the HA portion, and basically every 60 seconds it keeps trying again. If it's not getting a response, of course, it thinks it's the only one, and it will become active. So that's going to be something to think about when you're first configuring these as far as which one you want to do first. I have passive, which is basically the backup state, so it's going to be standby. So like I said, my active-passive idea. I have active, so that tells me that I am actually going to be processing traffic, moving things along. I could be in suspend mode, which is like an administrative down state. I can also have non-functional, which is more of an error condition. And then unknown, which is, well, almost equally bad. That kind of falls in the category of not working, and we don't know why. Perhaps you have bad karma. But those are the states that we're going to have in terms of my high availability. And honestly, that doesn't make a difference in what mode that I happen to have on there. Okay? So all of the interesting things. Now, when we start looking at the pieces parts for what's going to be going on in here. Okay? So everything that we have, and I guess let me kind of... Well, we can leave it on this page. It's perfectly fine. So my HA1 is a layer 3 interface, like I said, by default. Okay, so we'll call this layer 3 right here. We do have to put an IP address on it, whatever subnet we choose to do. And what we're going to have is two ports. So TCP, is it 28769 or TCP 49969. So high ports, okay? This one is regular, this one is SSL. Those are the two methods as far as communicating back and forth for my configuration. I would highly suggest the SSL side, of course. if it's a directly connected interface, you really probably don't have to care, no big deal. But because this is L3, I actually technically don't have to be directly connected in there. If I'm not directly connected, there is a gateway field on the HA1 configuration that would need to be configured. If they are directly connected or same subnet, don't configure that, because it'll just lead to extra extraneous traffic that you don't happen to need. So that's the way that HA1 happens to work. Now, HA2, like we said, synchronizes the state, the sessions, the routing table, the IKE and IPsec SAs, the ARP tables, things along those lines. By default, it is layer 2 transport, so L2 mode. And just kind of an interesting thing on here, we use an ether type value of 0x, what am I, 7261, I think? Maybe 7761. 7761. Go with that. So, but it can be configured to actually use IP or UDP as well. If I use IP, it's protocol 99, just in case we pick it with a sniffer and choose to care on there. If I do UDP, it is port 29281. So I don't know if I'd care to memorize the specific details, just know that by default it is layer 2 with an ether type, but I can choose IP protocol or UDP as well, so wherever we get. Now, what exactly does that tell us? While the recommended and certainly the easiest method is going to be back-to-back setup, the actually recommended just with crossover cables, nothing in between, nothing else to fail, no secondary failures, no other things to worry about, no hackers, no stuff like that. So easiest thing to reduce the complexity and margin for error is back-to-back with crossover cables. But you could have them physically separated by a switch or physically and logically separated by routers. It allows for lots of flexibility in terms of how I want to configure this. So sometimes we get into, my highly available design where we're talking about physically separate rooms, possibly even physically separate buildings, depending on how detailed we're getting about this, but lots of different configuration options that we have. And bottom line is my Palo Alto firewalls can support that method of high availability in there. One of my biggest problems that I have to worry about in HA environments, and while we actually do try to reduce complexity in things, is what we call split brain. So this is one of the large issues in here, and basically split brain, I can't say that 10 times fast today, so split brain describes a state in which both firewalls have reached a point where they both think that they are active. Even though I'm supposed to be in active-passive mode and one of them should not be processing traffic, some condition has occurred where they think that, oh yeah, the other one's not there, so therefore I will be active. So just kind of one of those interesting things, because they will assert themselves accordingly and send out, gratuitous ARPs and stuff like that, and may lead to confusion among the users or other sessions going on. So the passive device basically can't distinguish between peer down or simple communications problems. So again, if I have a switch in between here or a router or something like that, that device may be down or have a bad path or God knows what going on. But that may cause the communication between the two devices to not work. Well, you can't really, a passive device can't distinguish between those two. All it knows is, I'm not hearing anything from the other side, I don't know what's going on, yeah, I got nothing. So it's not working. If the active device loses, communication on the other side to the passive one, any link or path monitoring simply is not going to even be looked at. Right? So basically, if I lose my heartbeats on there, I no longer count everything else. So it's kind of an interesting idea for it anyway. Again, try to use your back-to-back stuff. Even from an interface perspective, if I'm riding, again, smaller devices, I have to share interfaces with what I might be using for my regular traffic, which could lead to all sorts of things like, overutilization, busy interface, dropped stuff, whatever's going on. Remember that in my larger firewalls. I have dedicated HA interfaces that really kind of help me avoid this problem along the way. The other thing that I can do to help avoid this is to configure what we call a heartbeat backup. And this gives me kind of a secondary path, if you will. Actually, it goes out to the management interface, so wherever I'm at down here, and will also send out heartbeats. So even if I lose my communication path along the primary one, if things are still working through the management, which again, hopefully my management is a separate VLAN, different from all the rest of my traffic over here, and not having to worry about, but I certainly am a separate interface in there. But as long as I have communication over that, then I can at least make things a little bit better. Okay. So device high availability from my configuration standpoint, we can look at my link and path monitoring, I can look at my heartbeat backup, all of those things that we have, really just giving us the ability to try to avoid this condition there. Okay. If, by the way, we start to use things, my virtual wire path, a VLAN path, or virtual router, all of these things that I can check on in my configuration, all of my building groups, my groups, my link groups that we have for my monitoring, I can check that. I can also use an any or all logic to determine thresholds for when I'm going to fail over between the two. Whatever things that you set for your condition of failover, should really be the same on both sides. So always kind of pay attention to that. I can also play with timers. Now my timers, for the most part are pretty good. Interestingly enough, we have 3 different settings. I can go with recommended. I can go with aggressive. Or I can do custom and specify my own set of information in there. So just, I guess, kind of a neat, an interesting thing that we have along the way. Now, once I start getting into this, okay, I mean, I've actually got lots of different things I can set the timers on, but the 3 primary ones, I'm going to pick kind of a different color here, are going to be my hello interval. So how often I say hello on there, it's actually my HA1 state. I have my heartbeat, which is also HA1, but it's my ICMP side of things. And I have what we call a promotion hold time. And that's how long it'll take after a failure detection to actually promote myself in there. Now, when I start looking at it between recommended and aggressive, okay, and these values are going to be in milliseconds, by the way. So I have 8,000 and 8,000. So basically, they're both the same for the hello interval. This can be configured anywhere between 8,000 and 60,000 milliseconds. So basically between 8 and 60 seconds. My heartbeat, on the other hand, is the same again. So 1,000 milliseconds and 1,000 milliseconds. It can be configured anywhere between 1,000 and 60,000. So between 1 second and 60 seconds. My promotion hold time is where things get a little bit different between my two methods on there. So in recommended mode, it's 2,000 milliseconds, so basically 2 seconds. In my aggressive mode, it's only 500 milliseconds, or half a second. This one can be set anywhere between 0 and 60,000 milliseconds. You have to be careful, though. When I'm doing this flip over, we all like to say, well, sure, shorter time is better. I want to react. I want to get in there. I want to switch over, make sure everything's going to be available, right? Sounds really good. Right up till you have a point where, your condition isn't quite ready for failover yet, but it kind of sort of matches the criteria you set, and you just don't want to have things flipping back and forth, because that can actually cause more problems to the stability of our network than if we just waited a little bit longer for doing the promotion in there. So play with it, see what the effect is going to be on your network and stuff like that. Just kind of watch for it. I do also have the ability of setting HA2 keep alives, by the way. Those are off by default. Recommended, we'll say HA2. I'll put these optional. So HA2 keep alive can be set anywhere between 5,000 and 60,000 milliseconds. Recommended, if we enable it, is 10,000. Okay, so 10 seconds in there. Whatever you happen to want to do in your particular environment is the way that it's going to be. So that's kind of the idea on how we do things and how we try to avoid my split brain scenario in there. Now, that's active-passive. Okay, I don't quite have the same approach with active-active because, well, both brains are going at the same time. So with active-active, like I said, both devices are actually processing traffic. Although there is load sharing going on, this is not the goal of active-active. Okay? So if you're going to do this, so if this is your endpoint design and say, hey, I got 2 firewalls, I'm good to go. If my first firewall is capable of 1 gig of traffic, having 2 of them does not mean that you can pump 2 gig of traffic through there. Well, okay, yes, technically it does. However, that's not the goal of the design. The reason for that is because what happens, remember these are highly available, so what happens if this one fails? Well, now you got 2 gig of traffic trying to go through a 1 gig capable device. That's not cool. So we have to be thinking about what the effect is going to be when we fail over. We're trying to be highly available, yes. That's for redundancy. That's not for added capabilities. Okay? So kind of bear that in mind as you're going through and putting these things in there. From planning perspective, you always want to plan for the worst case, which is a single unit being available in there. If you exceed the capabilities of the box that you have, you're going to be doing a disservice to your users, to your applications, and stuff like that, because having random drops without any regard to priority or sessions or anything like that really doesn't do anybody any good at all. So that's kind of one of those big things to pay attention to in there. Now, let me go back kind of looking at our graphic here real quick. When I do go into the active-active world, okay, in addition to the previously described HA1 and HA2 interfaces, we actually add an HA3 interface in there too. This is used for, we'll call it session handoff, okay, or session sharing, if you will. So basically, I have 2 primary paths. Well, if this one, my firewall 1 up here, is handling a session, and all of a sudden a packet comes in over here, because I've been sharing that session information, he knows about it, that, hey, this is active on firewall 1, HA3 is used to route, or to send, essentially, but to send that information up here for further processing. So while they are both active, they are not active for the same sessions at the same time. The data link, this part right here for session sharing, is for awareness. Okay, you may, because this link right here, we're 1 gig interfaces by default on stuff. If you're running into a scenario where this is becoming overly utilized or you're worried about that, you can, on larger devices, also create aggregate interfaces. So if I have lots of interfaces available, I may pair 2 or 3 together, and so now I have a 2 gig link or a 3 gig link, or I think upwards of 8, I believe, is the maximum I can do. But I have a larger interface or larger available bandwidth in there for sharing that information back and forth. Okay? Like anything else in there, if I have an overrun on my interface, it's going to lead to drops and session problems. So certainly watch out for that from my planning perspective, but otherwise, everything works the same from my active-active side of things, except that I'm adding this extra interface in there. Alright, so the wonderful world of HA. We've talked about the 2 modes that we have, well, essentially 2 modes anyway. So my active-passive and my active-active. So all the things that we're concerned with in there in terms of my interfaces. So which ones did I have over here? Yeah, my HA1 and HA2. And then over on this side, we add HA3 into the mix, which could also be the aggregate. It's a little small things. Under my active-passive, we did talk about my split brain and ways of avoiding that. For you and I, of course, we just drink some coffee, but that doesn't always help the firewalls. It's usually one of those voiding warranty things. We don't want to do that. But in a nutshell, that is my high availability concepts and a few design notes along the way in there. I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.